Welcome to our DBE Taskforce Workshop for Q2 of 2022. Thank you everybody for joining us today. We're excited to have a fantastic follow-up to last week's presentation, which was really good. So I hope everybody had a chance to fill out the post task force feedback, give us some feedback and help direct us for today's workshop. So it looks like people are still logging in. Just a couple housekeeping notes. Please do use the raise hand function and we can allow you to talk. And then if you have any written questions, if writing them or typing them is easier, please use the Q&A. That tends to work best, that we can see those. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Misha Caspear. Please do take it away, Misha.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks so much, Rebecca, or good afternoon if you're joining us from out of state somewhere. As Rebecca said, my name is Misha Caspear, and I'd like to start by acknowledging that my firm, MG Tech Writing LLC, is located on the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous people. My office within the community of what is now known as the town of Clarkdale, Arizona, resides on land that was cared for and called home by the Yavapai Apache, before them the Yavapai, Tonto Apache, and Hohokam people, and other native peoples from time immemorial. This land embodies great historical, spiritual, and personal significance for the original stewards, Native nations, and the peoples of Central Arizona. The mission of my firm, MG Tech Writing LLC, is to promote community health, wellness, and economic development through provision of multimodal transportation planning, professional grant and technical writing, and uniquely customized training and technical assistance services with a special focus on transportation-related program development and technical assistance for tribal and rural communities. In seeking to achieve that mission, I recognize, support, and advocate for the sovereignty of Native nations in this region and beyond. By offering this land acknowledgement, I wish to again affirm tribal sovereignty and my ongoing commitment to holding myself and my firm accountable to Native American peoples and nations. So having introduced myself and my firm, it's clear that I'm not an attorney. I don't have a license to practice law, and I'm providing this workshop today as an overview. I will be providing tips on negotiating tribal contracts and subcontracts, but this workshop does not seek to provide legal advice, rather to share some negotiation strategies that I've developed over the course of my career of working with tribes for over 30 years. To develop the best protections for your business and personal interests, you should always consult a skilled attorney or law firm. And when seeking to develop contractual agreements with tribes, you may look for a law group or attorney with background specifically in Indian law and direct experience with working with tribes. That being said, I have never needed to go to any deep extent. My contracts have always worked out well with tribes. And what I am going to encourage everyone to do numerous times during the presentation today is to enter tribal communities and tribal negotiations with an open heart and an open mind. So this is myself outside Newman Park Road, just before you get into the Flagstaff area. And you are today at navigating the ins and outs of tribal contracts and procurement. And so raise your hand if your firm has signed contracts with tribes in the past or is currently under contract with one or more tribal communities. I know last week we had some folks that had done some work with tribes. Do we have anybody back this week that's worked with tribes? Is potentially a tribal DBE themselves? Okay, great. Anyone else? Does anyone want to share some of their experience in working with tribes? if you raise your hand and want to share anything, you can raise your hand and let us know. Okay, so then moving on, please note in the chat box what you'd like to get out of this experience and this workshop today. Is there anything in particular you'd like to know? We did get a number of responses to the evaluation last week, and we're going to start by covering some of those topics. I see, Amy, you raised your hand. Did you want to share anything about your experience in working with tribes?
That was by accident, Misha. Sorry.
Okay. No problem. No problem. Okay. So if there's anything in particular you're looking to learn today, go ahead and drop that in the chat, and we'll try to make sure that we cover those things. There's going to be some time at the end for questions. So I'm going to go through some of these topics that were suggested to us pretty quickly, because we did cover a lot of these last week, and Rebecca did make that recording available to everybody. So if there's something you missed, you can certainly check last week's recording. But I just wanted to start briefly by talking about, why we work with tribes. We work with tribes because it's a very enriching experience. We are serving communities that have need, and we are serving communities where it's a pleasure to work because it is a small community, because of tribal sovereignty. They have the say in what gets done and how quickly. And so you can have a very profound influence in the work that you do on an entire population of people and on an entire community. The other thing is they tend to pay pretty quickly when they're invoiced, and that's always enjoyable when you're in business as well. So we got this question again, or we wanted some folks or we had some folks who said they wanted to talk a little more about this, how to identify tribal departments. And one of the things that we say almost to an annoying level, time and time again, about tribal work is that every tribe is unique. We have 574 going on 576 tribes in the United States right now that are federally recognized, and they are all different sovereign nations. And so that being said, when you start to research their websites, you'll find that every website is different and every tribe is different depending on their size generally as to whether they have various departments or not. So last week I showed the same slide. These are some of the different departments that you might start to look for on a tribal website. See, do they have any of these departments? And if so, who might you reach out to first? So typically, the Tribal Employment Rights Office, TARO, also known as Tribal Employment Rights Ordinance, is a good place to start if you're trying to find out about solicitations or potential contract work in tribal communities. Their business office, their taxation office. Now, again, not every tribe has a business office, a TARO office, or a taxation office. But if there's anyone here today who wanted to talk more about this and has some additional questions, you can certainly drop those in the chat or raise your hand. People mentioned that they wanted to hear a little more about Indian preference and TARO. So we talked about Indian preference, and this is very old legislation. So that's a live link, Indian preference, where it's highlighted there. First appeared in federal regulations in 1834. And so since then, most new laws and regulations related to tribes and American Indian Alaska Native people include preference provisions. So it is very long-standing law. That link that I have given you is to the CFR Code of Federal Regulations. And when you click on this link, it'll take you to the code, which is very, very comprehensive. If you put Indian preference in the search bar, you can see all the legalese related to Indian preference, why it exists, how it came about, and of course, why it's important. We have Indian preference, just like we have the Disadvantaged Business Enterprise Program, so that we can level out the playing field for Native Americans trying to get work and or contract opportunities, just like we have DBE, so that all of us as DBE firms have an equitable playing field. And so tribal employment rights ordinances, or TAROs, were initially enacted by tribes in late 1976 and early 1977. Today, there are almost 300 tribes and Alaska Native villages which are covered by TARA ordinances. So again, you heard me say that there are 574, going to be 576 tribes in the United States. So obviously not all of them have TARA ordinances. And it's incumbent on you to learn if you need to work with TARA, if that particular tribe that you're interested in working with has a TARA office or not. So I found this great guidebook that ADOT has published for use internally with its personnel, but it has great information about TARA and tribal transportation contracting, and lots of great information about how to work with tribes and things to observe in tribal relationships and building tribal relationships. So I've put the link here as a bit.ly link to shorten it, but you can download this handbook. It is very comprehensive, developed with ADOT and the Intertribal Council of Arizona together, and well over 200 pages. Might be good nighttime reading. In any case, TAROs exist to enforce tribally enacted Indian preference law to ensure that American Indian Alaska Native people gain their rightful share to employment, training, contracting, subcontracting, and business opportunities on and near reservations and Native villages. So if there's any more questions about that, we can talk about that further. Tribal ordinances in particular were enacted to address the deplorable rate of poverty, unemployment, underemployment that can sometimes exist in Native communities, to eliminate discriminatory or other historical barriers that tribal communities and tribal members have faced when they're trying to get employment or business opportunities on or near tribal lands. And then also to ensure that tribal members receive their rightful entitlements as intended and required under the tribal and federal Indian preference employment law. So again, there's a lot of information online about TARO, and if you have questions about a specific tribe's TARO program, I suggest talking to that tribe's TARO staff. People wanted to know more about how do we research tribes? How do we do tribal research? I shared a lot about using the Intertribal Council of Arizona's website last week, and you can find those links on that talk from last week. But here is an amazing book written by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. We had Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. This is an Indigenous People's History of the United States. So not picking up where Howard Zinn left off, but in that same vein, informing us of a lot of the history that we never learned in school. And this very specific to Indigenous peoples in the United States before first contact and moving forward from first contact into where we are today. A woman that I recently discovered who's an amazing speaker, often invited to speaking engagements, to be the keynote speaker at a lot of different tribal conferences. And when people are talking about Native Americans or how Native Americans are coming along in the United States, Karen Diver is somebody that is a go-to person to invite to conferences as a speaker. And so Karen used to be with us here at the University of Arizona. She was the director of business development for the Native American Advancement Initiatives. And that was the job she took after working for the Obama administration for 2 terms as their advisor for Native American affairs. And prior to joining the Obama administration, she was the first chairwoman of the Fond du Lac Band of Chippewa Indians in northern Minnesota. Currently, she works at the University of Minnesota as their first senior advisor to the president for Native American Affairs. And I want to share these couple of YouTube talks that she did. This first one she did at Berkeley was put together by grad students. She's interviewed by grad students. Grad students actually ask excellent questions at the end of her talk. The audio is kind of poor because it's filmed in a university classroom and there's people coming and going, dropping their pencils, whatnot. But she talks about, in like 45 minutes, the entire history of, Indigenous people in the United States. And it's pretty amazing. Quick overview, but very deep and powerful. The second talk by her is talks more about tribal sovereignty, about 20 minutes long. Where are we at right now, and where are tribes trying to move, relevant to both economic development, business opportunity, and just as nations in general. And I just have to say, you know, after the shootings in Buffalo a couple of weeks ago, I would pull this woman up every morning and listen to her YouTube talks rather than the news. In the tribal way, we talk about our aunties and our grandmas. And she has one of those auntie voices, one of those grandmotherly voices, very intelligent, has that kind of soulful wisdom, and also just an incredible book intellect about tribal history and whatnot. So I really recommend that if you want to learn more about tribes and just hear from a woman who speaks very well and very passionately about tribes, rather than reading the lengthy Dunbar Ortiz book or many other books that are out there, these talks can kind of teach you a lot. And of course, there's YouTube talks by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz as well. So I'm going to go through these next slides pretty quickly. This USA.gov website is really excellent because they keep it very updated, has cultural resources, has the current list of tribal leaders that is produced every year by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So you won't be able to get names of all the staff members or whatnot, but you can see who's the current tribal chairperson or president or executive director or whatever that particular tribe calls their leader. You can see a list of who those individuals are and find other resources. Great webpage. And this is the website. I sit on the planning committee for the National Transportation in Indian Country Conference. It's a fabulous conference. People ask to have us talk a little more about networking opportunities. Networking is one of the best ways that I win tribal contract work. And I can't speak highly enough of this conference, not because I'm on the planning committee. I went for many years, beginning in 2011 as a speaker before I ever joined the planning committee. But this is a talk that is about an hour and a half long, several different speakers, Tribal Transportation Program 101. It tells you just really from the perspective of the Federal Highway Administration and the federal government, how tribal transportation works, all the nuts and bolts and that sort of thing. So this is the link to that talk. And you can also find numerous other talks on nticc.org. Here we have, and this is taking a real deep dive. If you have an interest in Indian law, which I developed a passion for when I first began working with tribes, this is a great website, very well kept, very up to date, the National Indian Law Library. And on this particular page, you can see that they have these current and archive bulletins. So what's going on at the Supreme Court, tribal courts, within our own state, what's coming along with US regulatory information. If you want to track what's going on with tribes and get a feeling for why we talk about Indian law, why it's so deep, why it's so comprehensive, why it goes back to treaty rights and all these precedents, this is a great website to follow. Also, the Native American Rights Fund, who is under the umbrella of the National Indian Law Library, developed a great handout last year all about Indigenous voting rights and the challenge of voting in tribal communities. So if you have any inkling in working with tribal communities and helping to tackle the disenfranchisement that has existed historically as we look into these elections, that's a great resource, and that's through this website. The National Congress of American Indians is the leader in tribal policy development. National level organization. They are working one-to-one with the federal government at all times. This particular page discusses policy issues relevant to economic development and commerce. And I just want to mention that tribal nations in the United States were the first businesses, right? They were trading with one another. There was commerce going on long before first contact. And when first contact happened, tribal nations were the location that the settler colonial society went to begin having business relations. And so there is a long history of community relations with tribal nations relevant to business and that sort of thing. And so you can follow NCI NCAI's policy issues and this particular set of issues here at this website. People ask to hear about tribal business licenses. So I have business licenses in several different tribal communities, one in Nevada, 2 in New Mexico. And you don't have to obtain a tribal business license for every tribal community with which you work. But if they require that you do, then you will want to pay for one. I've never seen them be very costly. This business license that I've carried now since 2018 with Taos Pueblo is $25 a year. And they're real good about reminding you coming into your license is about to expire, please re-up with your $25. And it's a real easy form to fill out, no heavy duty details, asks you to talk about what tribal programs or enterprises you might be working with, and then give your tax ID number. And in the case of New Mexico, they want you to be registered with the Revenue Service so you can do your reporting on your estimated taxes and whatnot on a regular basis, and they just want your code number for New Mexico tax purposes. Anyway, that's pretty simple. That's how simple it's been with every tribe that I've worked with that has required a business license. In many cases, if they have business licenses, that is one of the requirements you may have to fulfill in order to be able to work with them. These are some of the many primes that work with tribes. This is not all the tribes or all the primes that work with tribes or all the businesses. There are hundreds out there, but these are some of the names that you may already know that are particularly in engineering, planning, architecture, design. Some are native owned. I'm featuring Merwin Yellowhair's business here down on the bottom right. Merwin was on our talk last week. I'm not sure if Merwin's here today, but in any case, if you're looking for work with a prime as a sub-consultant, these are some firms that you might consider reaching out to. In the case of the Tohono O'odham Nation, they have a very strong tarot program. They have a very strong tarot website, and I shared that last week and also on an earlier slide, a couple slides before, and they publish their own kind of on-call list of the Indian preference firms that have certified with them. And so you can find this on their website, on their tarot page. And this is just 2 of the 3 pages that they provide information about, but this is kind of their on-call list of who they've pre-qualified as Indian preference firms. So if you're looking to find a prime that is already pre-qualified as Indian preference, and you do any of the services they provide, you can certainly download these documents from the tarot website at Tohono O'odham. And not every tribe does this, but it's a neat opportunity that they provide this information and the contacts and also the type of business that's operating. Gross receipts tax is not something that I've had to pay regularly, but in working in New Mexico, I've had to pay tribal gross receipts tax, working with Taos Pueblo and the Pueblo de Cochiti. I've not seen it anywhere else. And so what is tribal gross receipts tax? Well, in the case of Taos Pueblo, it's 7.5%. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. Basically, it's substantially similar to New Mexico's gross receipts tax. And any person or business who sells services or goods or leases property on tribal lands has to report and pay these gross sales receipts taxes. And so there's some exceptions that you would have to find out from their taxation office or business office and whether you are one of those exempt businesses. But these gross receipts taxes, even though they're imposed on a business, it's common for a business, and this is what I do, to pass that gross receipts on to the purchaser by separating it out on my invoice. So I indicate what I'm billing them, and then I show a separate line for the 7.5%, so that it's not this burdensome cost out of the blue that I'm paying just because I'm working with Taos Pueblo. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it. It can get pretty complicated. It's tax law after all. But again, a tribal business office or a tribal taxation office can answer any questions about this. And again, I've never seen it with the exception of working with the Pueblos in New Mexico. I don't know that other Pueblos in New Mexico do this. I just know that the two that I've been working with do. So it is something that if you contract with those particular two Pueblos and possibly other tribes or Pueblos in the United States, you may encounter this. And just to show you, you know, because as I indicated, it's the same as the gross receipts tax. They're charging all over New Mexico. So this is the second page of the handout. And now I know you cannot possibly read this, it's too small, but you will see, or, you know, I can tell you that there are many Pueblos on here. Other tribes are listed on here. And many other rural and urban communities in New Mexico are listed on here with all their gross receipts tax rates. So networking events. Now I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. Upcoming at the end of this month, we're doing the National Rural Transit Assistance Program is sponsoring a 2-day workshop on tribal transit. I will be there for 2 days training on capital project development and capital project management. We have all this great new money coming down under the bipartisan infrastructure law, but tribes are really challenged right now to keep up with A, the grant writing, and B, the putting of these CARES Act projects and this COVID project money and these new transit grants, getting all these things in the pipeline and getting them going and building these projects. There's a lot of opportunity out there for us who do construction type projects, who do transportation related projects. In general, there's just good work with tribes right now. So this workshop, here's the registration link. We're still taking registrants. We're up to about 64 people as of yesterday. It will be at the High Country Conference Center. There's a block of lodging at the Drury Inn there. And encourage you to come out. It's coming up right away. It's an event where you can get your face in front of not just Arizona tribes. We're going to have tribes coming from all over the country to this event. Talk to you about National Indian Country Conference. It's going to be in Louisville in August this year. I'm not going to say much more about it other than to point out that this is a screenshot of their website. When you go to nticc.org and you see up here on the right at the top toolbar are the archives, you can play any of the breakout sessions from the last 2 years that were recorded and get a feeling for what this conference is like and the great speakers that it typically has and some of the tribal voices there, and see if you might want to attend based on the virtual conferences we did the last 2 years. We are excited we're going to be in person coming up. Other networking, I really encourage you as businesses to consider being sponsors or exhibitors at tribal conferences. I'm not going to go into a lot of the details here. These 2 links get you to a very comprehensive sponsorship packet for the NTICC conference, and there's a separate registration if you go to NTICC as a sponsor or exhibitor, and that's at this link. But consider being a sponsor at these events because people are walking by. We like to do at NTICC, we do bingo to make people come to your table so they'll fill out their bingo card and maybe win a Pendleton blanket later. So it's a great networking event. I have been working now with ADOT on this upcoming Traffic Safety and Injury Prevention Summit. We've been working as a planning committee now going on 3 years because of COVID and because we just want to do this in person. We're not going to do a hybrid. We're not going to do virtual. We want to do this in person. So right now we're looking at Cliff Castle Casino. Please save the dates for November 2nd and 3rd. It's a good central location, great hopping off place to Sedona. We will have opportunities for vendors. Keep watch. Right now we don't have a website or anything. And these are proposed dates. Excuse me. I talked about Intertribal Transportation Association. They have their mid-year conference. It's going to be virtual this year on June 28th and 30th. If you want information for how to register for that, their website is not kept very up to date. I don't run that website. I'll just apologize on their behalf. But if you want information and how to potentially attend the virtual mid-year conference, email me and I'll put you in contact with whom you need to contact. And then their annual meeting is going to be in Vegas this year. They usually do it at the Tropicana. I'm not sure if it's going to be at the Tropicana this year. It will be December 6th through 8th. Merwin mentioned this conference last week, and I think Rebecca Morris has some familiarity with this. Rebecca, have you ever actually attended this conference? This Construction in Indian Country conference?
I have, but it has been a few years. But yeah, it's a big conference.
Yeah, it's had a great agenda. I've never actually been to it, but that being said, I know it's very popular. It's already taken place this year, but just save the date for next year, May, and they typically do it in this area of the state around Chandler and that area. And this is their website. It's been their website for years. It's sponsored through ASU, so you can check back and see, when it's coming. We talked about tribal grantees. People wanted to hear a little more about that. We just had an announcement yesterday from Federal Highway Administration about the new Tribal Transportation Program safety funds that are available. The notice of funding opportunity just was published. And so I gave you last week a handout of the grantees that just heard they won awards here in Arizona and across the United States. They are all going to be doing roadway related or transportation related safety projects. That's a great contact list to get started and market construction or other services to those tribes, planning, design services and whatnot. This is another website I had up last week, HUD, and of course, many federal departments. I think we have like 27 federal agencies at least, give grants to tribes. So you can dig around the federal government's grantee websites and see these lists of who's gotten these awards. So Indian Community Development Block Grants, just like our community development block grants that we have in every community in Arizona and at the county level, there is a special set aside for tribal communities. These are often housing projects and whatnot. So here's the link where you can find this website that looks like what you see on the screen. And then when you get there, you can download these lists of grantees and see who you may want to market to if they're doing projects similar to the kinds of work that you do. Okay, tribal etiquette. Now, interestingly, this is stuff that I learned more from the kindergartners and second graders I worked with when I was a teacher on the White Mountain Apache Indian Tribe for the Bureau of Indian Education. Because children can be softer when they correct you. But typically, when you do community meetings or public outreach on tribal lands, you want to open these meetings with a prayer. And not you opening with the prayer. It should be a member of the community. So I will typically look for an elder in the room and ask them if they would like to give a prayer. And if they don't want to, that's good. I'll ask someone else. Or I go to someone who's a tribal member that I know has some position of authority in the community, tribal department head, and that sort of thing, and ask them to do the prayer. We didn't open with a prayer today. That's not appropriate for something like this. But when you go into tribal communities, it shows a knowledge of the community that you offer to start and propose your agenda to start with a prayer. That will you will show them that you have an understanding of the culture and how that is done. And what's neat is this is non-denominational. So, it's not Catholic, it is to the creator per se, however you recognize the creator. And so it is a good way to open meetings. And it's just basically a blessing and asking for strong communication during the meeting and guidance during the meeting. So another point of advice, and raise your hand if you might have an example of a microaggression or can tell us from your own perspective, what is a microaggression? But beware of anything you might say that's a microaggression. Or coming off disingenuous. You're not there to save anyone. You're not there to fix everything. You are there to provide a service. You are there as a professional person trying to provide the same kind of service you would anywhere else. And so just be careful that you're not trying too hard, because maybe it's your first time in a tribal community. Maybe you're not that comfortable yet, but don't get into a performative or extractive sort of relationship. Performative, if I act like this, or if I come off like this, just be yourself, because they're looking for that. Their history is fraught with people being performative and extractive. Extractive being, we came for your resources. Zero sum. If I do this service for you, you owe me something. And by owing you something, yes, of course, we're working to get paid. But if you have an energy of something else you want in return, they'll feel that. And that's disingenuous. So just be careful that you're just yourself and present yourself. Can anyone speak to this issue of handshakes and why I've included handshakes as something to think about relevant to tribal etiquette? Has anybody had an experience with the handshakes that they'd like to share? So we're taught in American society and larger society to give people a firm handshake. And that firm handshake is supposed to represent your confidence and assertiveness, that you're not shy. I'm here, get to know me, here's my hand. It's a little different for tribal people. And so I just want to share this with you, because the first time you experienced this, it could be off-putting to you, especially if you're a man. But in any case, you stick out your hand, and typically outside of tribal communities, you're given a firm handshake back. If you stick out your hand to a lot of people in tribal communities, especially Native women, elders, they give you a hand back that is very soft. Sometimes they barely touch your hand back. Sometimes it's almost as if they stroked the inside of your hand. And for a man, that could be a little creepy, but that's not what that is. That's not any kind of come on or weirdness. It's just, it's respect. And it's their way of greeting you, and it's different than this firm handshake. So I had an experience with a guy who worked for the federal government, and he did a keynote at one of the NTICC sessions we did in Myrtle Beach. Great keynote. And I stopped him in the hallway later during a bathroom break and just said, great keynote, wanted to introduce myself, stuck out my hand, and he grabbed my hand, and I'm telling you, 2 minutes later, my hand still hurt. And I said to him, I need to tell you something. I said, please, the entire time you're here for the rest of this conference, don't shake anybody else's hand like that. Please don't. And then I said, put your hand out again, please. And I touched him in the way that many people will touch your hand and or shake your hand as Native Americans do. And I said, now this is how you need to expect to be greeted when you put out your hand. Please don't squeeze anybody's hand like that. It's off-putting. So it's something that until you have that experience, you might not know, but it is something to know. And if you go into the community with that knowledge, then they're going to go, hey, this person already gets us. And it may not be universal to all tribes. I've not been to all 574 communities in the United States. But everywhere I've gone to tribal conferences and whatnot, with people representative from all over the country, that's what I've experienced with the handshakes. Be careful not to impose your understanding or any judgments you have of how urban society works or rural communities work, or how government should work, or with this experience that you're having in the tribal community. Accept with an open mind and open heart what you see and experience there, and try not to judge it, because it may look different to you. And I've had experiences where I've gone with the Anglo people into tribal communities. I get all these questions. Well, why are there vehicles like this? Why are the houses like this? Why are the roadways like this? And that's coming in with a judgment and an understanding from outside that community that you think that community should look like or act like or perform in the same way you do outside of that community. And that will be a barrier to you if you're trying to work with people, because they'll detect that. They'll know that you are looking at those things and judging those things. And there's a lot you don't know that led to why the vehicles and the housing and the roadways all look like this. And so rather than asking why they don't look like what you're familiar with, the question is, what is the history that has led to what I'm seeing here today? So the other thing is, be very careful about talking about politics. Large scale politics, national politics, local politics, definitely not tribal politics. You can't vote there. So if you express an allegiance, all you're going to do is upset somebody with a different allegiance. So just don't even talk about it. If it's brought up to you, you listen with a smile and you move on. There can be a lot of politics in tribal communities. There's a lot of politics everywhere we go. Just be careful that you don't have a strong expression one way or the other. You are a neutral party. You are there to provide business services, and move on. Couple other things. Beware of pointing. We don't point. We should have been taught when we were children in general not to point at people, but we don't point. And this first link is an article about why pointing is taboo in tribal communities. And then there's this great YouTube clip, it's like 7 seconds long, called "The Proper Last Real Indian's Lip Point." And it just shows you this gentleman doing the lip point and how we get to the lip point in conversation. But you will see, rather than people pointing with their fingers or their hands, that they use their lips or their chin and gesture in that way, rather than using their fingers. And there's many reasons for that. And I encourage you to read the article because it's very interesting. And it makes a lot of sense. The Department of Energy published an employee guide. It's quite old now. I want to say it's like from 2008, maybe even earlier than that. So I don't know that I would recommend it because a lot of it's just not even current anymore. But there are some good things in there about etiquette. And I liked what they had to say about eye contact. And you're not going to experience this everywhere you go, especially the younger people in tribal communities tend to have more eye contact. But the elders still really are very demure in their eye contact. And so sometimes to them, prolonged eye contact is inappropriate. And so it's respectful to you that they're not looking right in your eyes. And it's respectful of age if you don't look directly in an elder's eyes. And so just know that if they're not looking at you right in your face when you're talking to them, it doesn't mean they're not listening to you. It just means that to them is a sign of respect. If you're really loud, and it's not that you can't be loud or happy or boisterous, people do get loud, happy, and boisterous everywhere. But just be careful that, in a meeting setting, you're not the really loud person in the room. And then if you express a lot of impatience, you're looking at your watch, you're cleaning your nails, that's not a good first impression. They can have very different concepts of time. I spoke last week about the holistic nature of tribal communities and things being done in a circular fashion. And so just be aware of that. Try when possible to have your public meetings with food. Food brings happiness. Food brings people out of the woodwork. Food brings people to the meetings they would never otherwise attend. And so I try to do my agendas around potluck lunch or dinner. And I always ask that they serve traditional foods. So I don't prepare those because I'm usually coming in, I might be in Alaska doing my work. So I'm not bringing that, but I will ask them to serve a traditional meal for the sign of respect that gives to them. The fact that traditional food brings people out more than pizza. And it allows you to learn more about those peoples and those foods and why they eat those foods and the history of that in their culture. And then breaking bread with people is just such a good way to start conversation. So stopping your meeting for this lunch or having this dinner and the rest of your agenda and sitting down to break bread is a good way to open up dialogue. And then laughter is good medicine. I think Reader's Digest said that first. Anyway, I try always when I'm talking in front of tribal groups to get to the laugh. That's my goal in the first few minutes, is to get to the laugh. Often I get that laugh by making fun of myself in some ways. You know, I'm like 4'10", so that's always a good starting place to bust on myself for, you know, not being tall enough to even see you over the dais kind of thing. But just make sure that your laughter is never at anyone's expense. But I find that once I've gotten that laugh, everybody kind of relaxes a little more and they feel a little more trust for you. Here's the lip point. So this is just a screenshot of this YouTube clip. I gave you the website. It's fun to watch. Okay, so part of the meat of why we came today, reading and responding to solicitations. So if you can't sleep, reading solicitations and contracts are definitely a cure for insomnia. Now, that being said, both solicitations and contracts are something that you should read with a clear head and with a fine tooth comb and with your red pen. So what we're going to do is a couple of exercises, and Rebecca sent you some handouts. And so you should have those handouts. And we're going to look first at handout 1. And handout 1 is just a single page request for bid. And you'll see that I've redacted these because it's not my intent today to talk in particular about what anybody did right or wrong. But we will talk about the language of solicitations, why we may or may not feel comfortable to respond to things, and the kind of questions we should ask. So just take, this is a very short request for bids. Take about the next 3 minutes to read this single page on handout 1. It's labeled handout 1 on the top left. And we'll start with that. And when we finish with that, then I have a couple questions for you. And or if you have any questions, let me know. And then we'll read the second handout and we'll do a fun activity. Okay, we'll take another few seconds to finish reading this handout 1. Okay, so does anybody have any thoughts about this? Single page request for bid. Is there anything that strikes you as you read this? What question might you ask the offerer about this solicitation? So I'll just provide a little history. So I received this solicitation, and I received this solicitation from a client I'd had for many years, but hadn't worked with in a couple of years, and came across email just as a single page attachment, just like you see it here. And, you know, you see that there's a deadline there. And I received it on the 17th of May. And who can tell me what the deadline was? So it was due on May 28th. So effectively, having seen it late in the afternoon, I had 11 days to respond with a bid on this set of projects. And does anybody have any thoughts about the language of what I was asked to bid on? I guess my question is, does it seem clear to you what you're being asked? And the things that are being redacted are the tribal names and addresses and specifics. But other than that, you have all the language I had. Okay. Juan says the schedule to complete tasks. Yeah, that's not in there, is it? And then in the Q&A, Steve Williams, no, it is not clear. What else? Would you respond to this solicitation? Given what you see here, would you respond? Raise your hand if you would respond to this solicitation with the information you have. Keeping in mind that you had 11 days, you could email and ask some questions. It doesn't say you can't call or ask questions. But how do you feel about this? How do you feel about this offer? So my reaction was, A, I didn't have enough time. And B, even though I was familiar with several of these projects that are listed, it wasn't always clear to me in the list whether they wanted me to write a grant. In some cases, I mean, they're asking me to provide a bid for planning and grant writing, but then they tell me they've already gotten a grant and the project was funded. So then, you know, am I doing, you know, I don't do planning and design. That's not something my firm does. So what were they asking? I understood that on the second bullet point, they wanted help to write a raise grant. I understood on the third bullet point that they wanted to have assistance in writing for additional transit grants. You know, I helped them start their transit program through a capital grant I wrote. Kim says, yes, it's too vague. So my decision wasn't to do it. And I did not respond. I thanked them for thinking of me and sending it, but I did not respond. So now this is not typically what I see, but you know, it's the kind of thing that you might see. Okay, now we're going to look at this second handout, and it's a little bit longer. I have specifically tried to choose examples today that are short. It doesn't mean that there's not really long solicitations out there of 80 to 100 pages. When they include a draft contract, they're going to be 80 to 100 pages potentially. Steve says, not sure if low bid, the scope of work is not clear. What are timeframes if avoided? Yes, all excellent questions. And so that was my other point in sharing this particular solicitation, not at all to beat up on this particular tribe or how they issued this solicitation, although they could certainly stand to do some development in their learning about how to issue solicitations. My point was, let's think about the kind of questions we need to ask if we want to submit a proposal. These are good people to work with. I just didn't have time to even think about it in 11 days, or all these questions that I had indicated to me they weren't organized enough for me to want to get involved. All right, so let's look at the second handout, handout 2, titled Request for Proposals for Environmental Assessment, Transportation OES Complex. So we're going to take about 7 or 8 minutes to read this. And then I want you to think about questions you might have, and then just how you feel about the solicitation. Actually, let's do this exercise. So we're going to do this scavenger hunt. So I want you to raise your hand or put in the chat pod when you find the answer to any of these questions about this solicitation. And then if this information is not in this solicitation, then you can put in the chat pod that it's not. But, and you can raise your hand if you find the answer to any of these. You can raise your hand or you can put the answer of where it is in the solicitation in the chat pod. Okay, Joyce says that the solicitation says that 8 hard copies and 1 digital PDF copy with supporting documentation. Now, my question, Joy, is that 8 copies of the proposal? Or is that 8 copies of the final environmental assessment and 1 digital copy? Steve's right, at least 3 references per project. Great. Joy's right. Yes, 8 hard copies and 1 digital copy of the final environmental assessment. Steve says he doesn't see a solicitation number, and Steve's right, there is no solicitation number. Often with tribes, you won't see a solicitation number, probably because they're not issuing that many. In this case of large government systems, you'll see a lot of solicitation numbers. Steve, I'm not sure what you mean RFP. Are you just identifying that this is in fact a request for proposals, or what did you mean by sharing RFP? Kim says that the RFP due date is September 2nd and there's no budget provided. That is correct. And Joyce says, I don't see any proposal format guidelines, page number, font size, etc. And that would be correct. And Steve has said even further, yes, 5 p.m. on September 2nd, 2019. And hard copy or electronic. Yes, good. Okay, so we're going to spend about another minute or two on this. So if you haven't read the whole thing, that's fine. And you can answer any of the questions as you come across the answers, whether you've read to the end of the solicitation or not. Juan says no DBE goal or even mentioned, and that would be correct. Okay, so let's stop there. And then, you know, again, anyone, you can drop in the chat. Steve has said no pre-bid conference dates. No, there weren't. And why do you suspect there were no pre-conference dates? What would be the challenge of having a pre-conference on this particular solicitation? What do we notice about the dates in this solicitation? The time frame, exactly. So given the time frame, would you respond to this solicitation if you did environmental assessments? And Joy mentions this too, the short turnaround between the RFP release, the internal review, et cetera. Yeah, and not just the review and when you're notified of the potential award of this, but you know, it's due on the 2nd and you have to finish the environmental assessment by the 23rd. And, you know, I don't know how much time you spent working with the Army Corps of Engineers or folks like that. Moving them in that kind of time frame can be, you know, pretty monumental. Juan mentions 4 buildings in yellow or outside the red marked area. Yes, good observation, Juan. Okay, so looking at this and considering the example, and let me go on to the answers so you guys can see all the answers. So this is where the answers were to everything. There was no solicitation number. There was no pre-bid conference. There was no page limit. There was no number of proposal copies, but you should ask that question, right? A lot of these things that they don't put in the language are questions you may want to consider asking about. How quickly must subcontractors be paid? There's no discussion of subcontractors in here at all. So you may want to raise those questions. Yes, there was a very short window between when you know, this was issued and when it would be awarded, and you didn't have a whole lot of time to ask any questions. But certainly if you are going to take on a project that has a short time frame like this, you want all your questions answered up front. But is that off-putting to you? Just that there's a short window. If you did environmental assessments all the time, and you thought you could do this, or you had a large enough staff and you thought you could do this, was there any other reason you might not want to respond to this? In general, I thought it was a pretty well-written, although short, RFP. Steve says, if a question is asked, does it have to go back out to solicitation? In this case, yes. Okay, so I'm going to share with you the two questions that were asked. And the first one was submitted by an engineering firm, which was a great question. Is the September 23rd deadline a hard deadline? And they said, yes, it is. That's it. We're inflexible on that. And then the second question that they got was, can you provide the funding source for the transportation OEX complex? Now, why would you ask that? What was missing in this RFP that the answer to that question about the funding source could help you know? So if you know the funding source, and I've just taught you how to go look up tribal grantees, then you can go look at that funding source and see if they funded these guys. And then you could see what the budget for this might be. So that's why we asked that. Okay. All right. So moving on. And this exercise was really to teach you the kinds of things to be thinking about and the kinds of things to be reading for. We need to be reading for all these kinds of things in our solicitations. Okay, so tribal contracts. So the main thing I want you to take away is don't be afraid to pursue the contract terms that work best for your firm and for your needs, and to use your own contract whenever possible, because it's business. And so what you see here pictured on the right is, this is a prime contractor I worked for out of Reno, Nevada for several years. I was a subcontractor to ADOT on Safe Routes to School programs for many years with these guys, NCE. And so in responding to a solicitation that had a contract attached, a draft contract attached, you'll sometimes see that they went through that contract and proposed back to ADOT some of the language they'd like to see changed. And so it is certainly your right to do that, even if it's ADOT, and most especially if it's ADOT or a DOT or a federal government agency at that level, because on a large scale project like you might be doing with an ADOT, you definitely want this to work for you and not find yourself in some kind of bind because you didn't ask the right questions, because you didn't ask for the right things and get what it was your firm needed. And you have to remember that, there's not like this team of lawyers sitting behind. Yes, there's a team of lawyers who probably came up with this, solicitation, and there's a whole procurement department for that. And there's people that advise ADOT, and there's people that advise, we have tribal attorneys general, and we have tribal attorneys, and we have prime contractors who do have attorneys, but they're not just like sitting there on the phone at the ready, right? Because attorneys cost a lot of money. And so, again, ask for what you need and be ready to stand by that, but also, know what your red lines are. So it doesn't always make sense to start with your own contract, and that might be off-putting with a brand new client, and it might be off-putting to tribes, but sometimes they'll ask you if you have a contract, and that can be a good starting place because then you've already got the terms you want and you're negotiating from the strongest place. But know going into any of these negotiations what you will and will not live with. So what are your red lines? If you can't get to agreement on certain terms, are you willing to walk away from this opportunity? And how much does it mean to you? And what might be the cost if you do that? And then recognize that tribal contracts often come with a dispute clause, a dispute resolution clause, or an arbitration clause, requiring that the parties resolve their conflicts or concerns in tribal court. And of course, they're going to put tribal court. They're not going to want to negotiate in state court. And over the evolution of my contract development for my business, I've changed those clauses in my own contracts. And truth being, nowadays, I'd rather resolve any situations in tribal court. It's never happened to me. I hope it never happens to anybody. You should have better communication with that on your contracts and with your projects. Hopefully you never have that. But I'd rather be in tribal court than state court. And originally when I wrote my contracts, I said I would, do the arbitration in state court. But try to remember why tribes are saying and insisting on, again, tribal sovereignty, their own tribal negotiations, negotiating on their own turf. All right, we're going to talk briefly about, here's a question. Steve says, if there is multiple awards, and if you request a change and they agree, would all awarded have to follow? That I can't say that because I haven't seen that situation. I would say you would have to, I would say, don't worry about that. If what you're asking is if several people win a contract and their contracts look different because you negotiated certain things you wanted or needed, but an ADOT or a tribe or a prime didn't want to do that with somebody else, and that firm or person didn't think to negotiate those things, then you did well for yourself. But I don't know that they then have to make all the contracts look like that. I don't think so. But that would be a question for procurement or even an attorney to answer. And as I said at the top, I am neither of those things. Subcontracts can be even more challenging, right? Because you are starting from a place where you're just not going to be the boss. And you're negotiating with somebody who's proposing to be your boss. And that's costing you some autonomy. And you have to be careful with that because you are entering into a partnership with this firm. And if you've never worked with them before, partnerships are like getting married to somebody, even if it's a brief period of time that you're working together. Subcontracts ask for a lot of intense stuff. I've seen 30-page subcontracts for pretty small contracts. I've seen, ridiculously long subcontracts with ridiculous clauses in them for stuff that is not even that important. So you have to be careful and recognize that, if this prime is national and their home office is in another state, it can be really hard to negotiate. I spent a month once negotiating a subcontract, trying to get them to pull out workman's comp because I'm a sole proprietor. And that was obvious, but it took us 4 weeks to get to that because they had like a 40-page contract. I saw a subcontract a couple of years ago when I was working as a sub to ADOT on a project that was for a series of workshops. And we were going to develop a workbook to accompany those workshops. And this subcontractor wanted me to sign half a page of drone regulations and how I'm going to use my drone or not use my drone or be careful with my drone. I don't have a drone. So yeah, I took that all out of there. I'm not signing off on that. So stand your ground, ask for what you need, especially your payment terms. In the subcontracting world, often the language is you don't get paid until they get paid by the offerer or, who owns the project. So if it's ADOT and you're working under a prime and ADOT takes 45 days to pay them, and then it's another 30 days to pay you, then you've waited quite a while. And can your firm bear that? And if not, then ask for what you can live with. And if you can't live with that, then you may have to decide that this isn't the project for you. I once waited 120 days to be paid as a subcontractor. Trust me, after that experience, I called the prime and I said, this doesn't work for me. We need to renegotiate this subcontract. I need to be paid half of what I invoice you, and then the other half when AUDOT pays you. And they agreed to that. They knew what it was like to live in the world of when they first started, and these payments were taking forever. And that's typical with DOTs. I'm not picking on ADA. That's typical of large scale state organizations. But as I said, there's not necessarily a team of attorneys. And sometimes, the prime will threaten you with the legal team. And the question is, do they really have the time or the money to be calling these legal folks all the time? Or are they just kind of putting you off because they don't want to negotiate that clause? You've got to figure that out and negotiate from your strongest place. So again, don't sign off on drone standards or workman's comp if it doesn't apply to you. Have them take that out. And very, very carefully review subcontracts where they talk about intellectual property, wording that appears like in perpetuity, where applicable. That's too general. That's committing you to too much. If they reference international business constraints and neither the prime or you work outside the US, then why is that even in there? Remember that a lot of people, for the ease of it, use templates. But it is incumbent upon you to take all the template language out that doesn't apply to you, and don't sign off on stuff that you shouldn't. Okay, so we've got a few minutes left. I want to read at least, we're not going to read both of these contracts because of the time, but I do want to read at least one of these contracts, and then I'll go quickly through a couple of tips and tricks for proposal writing. Let's read the one that is the agreement between, actually, no, let's read Handout 4. So reading Handout 4 will take the next few minutes, about 5 minutes, to read Handout 4, this professional services contract, MG Tech Writing LLC. Okay, I'm going to stop us here and just point out a few things. And then if you have any comments about this particular contract, then go ahead and drop those in the chat. But I want us to have just a few minutes for questions. But the compensation clause has been changed. So the draft I received of this professional services contract did not have the lines where it starts, "It is mutually understood," and the contractor, "the acts of God or other circumstances beyond the contractor's reasonable control." For example, the postponement or cancellation of planned tribal transportation program projects, et cetera, due to health concerns and COVID-19. So beginning in 2020, I started putting COVID-19 in all my contracts because I didn't want there to be a circumstance where I've done a lot of work, like I might do on a webinar like we're doing today, where the bulk of the work is me preparing the PowerPoint. And then if I got sick and couldn't make it, how do I make sure I'm still going to be compensated for my time? Or, you know, I've written you a grant, but you got COVID-19 and you didn't turn it in on time. So then that grant opportunity was lost. Are you going to turn around and say you're not going to pay me because you got COVID-19? So it's just an additional protection because things got pretty crazy for a while there. And so I've added this to every contract that I've signed since 2020. And I will keep adding it as long as we have variants and this is an issue and this pandemic takes off and on. It's never come up that I've needed it. But we certainly have people still coming down with COVID-19, and it could be something that I have to consider or have been really glad I had in my contract. The other thing I want to point out is the dispute resolution. I like this dispute resolution. This is a good dispute resolution with a tribe. So this is on the last page. It is item 13. And I'm just going to say it's a really great model for how you might want to arbitrate. God forbid anything goes wrong. All right, so now we're just going to open it up to questions. We have just a few minutes left. And so, you know, if you want to raise your hand, we can open your mic, or you can put things in the chat as you've been doing. Either way you're most comfortable. Any questions that you have. And I'm going to be sending a PDF copy of this PowerPoint to Rebecca as soon as we're done here. And there are several slides I didn't get to that are kind of tips and tricks for proposal writing that I think you'll find very useful. There is a session that I do regularly on reading and responding to solicitations. So this presentation is a lot longer than the time we've had. But Joy Render asks, Misha, I have to prep for my next call. Thank you. This was very helpful. Thanks, Joy. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. Does anyone have any questions, comments about this last contract you read? Comments about tribal contracts, about tribal solicitations, about seeking tribal work? Well, if there aren't any hands up or any questions, you know, if you'd like, I can go through these last couple of slides for the next minute or two. Let me fast forward here to a couple of slides I had about. Just going to leave you with this. When you're writing proposals, remember that your proposal is a story that opens with your firm's background, then builds the case with evidence. Your evidence is the work you've done. In this case, the evidence you may have done in communities of color or tribal communities, and your successful work history with tribes or communities of color or rural communities. And so you're proposing to them that you can solve their problems. And you're going to lead the reviewers while they're reading your proposal to draw the conclusion that your firm is the best solution they can have. So there's a lot of other tips and tricks here, other slides and different things. I'm just going to forward through these things. And so you can see there's a lot more information here. And providing my contact information. Please feel free to reach out and ask any questions. Give me a call, shoot me an email, and try to get to some of these tribal networking events if you can, because it's a great opportunity, like I said, to get your firm in front of tribal leaders, tribal organizations that are interested in your kinds of opportunities. It's a great opportunity as a vendor or a sponsor to be able to meet a lot of folks, tribal department heads, tribal leaders, those that are running tribal projects, issuing solicitations. So if you didn't participate last week, I really highly recommend that you seek that recording and listen to that recording, and then and take a look at the rest of this presentation. We covered a lot today, and I didn't get to everything, but again, you can always reach out and ask any questions. So if there aren't any other questions, I just, well, there's someone there. Steve, thank you. Thank you, Steve, for your compliments and for your participation. And I hope this was useful to people, and that, you know, you will, if you have not done any tribal contract work in the past, that you will pursue it now. Don't be shy. It's great work. It's extremely rewarding. And if there aren't any further questions, then I'll let you guys go for today. And you can reach out to me anytime.
Thank you again, Misha, for another fantastic presentation. Francesca, did you want to turn your camera on? Do you have any updates or any comments from ADAT before we adjourn?
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone for their time today. Thank you again, Misha. Thank you, Rebecca, for coordinating such a valuable and useful workshop and meeting from last week. Again, you can access the recording on our webpage, as well as Rebecca will send it out to all the registered attendees. Just want everyone to know that we do have the ADAT DBE Expo coming up on August 10th. So please stay connected to our DBE communications, because that's where you'll see all the updates related to not only our events, but any upcoming solicitations and any general announcements that we provide related to IIJA. So make sure you stay tuned there, and I'll put that website in the chat here. Otherwise, have a great day, everyone, and thank you again.
Thanks, everybody.